It was not the absence of life that unsettled the observer's orbiting object Obsidian, but the precise silence of it, as if the void itself had made space for something more ancient than movement, more calculating than death, and from the very first scan that failed to return, to the last distress signal that cut off mid-sentence. Every alien species with a claim to power had come to the same reluctant conclusion. This ship was not abandoned. It was watching Lieutenant Commander Juno Reese, was not chosen because she was fearless, though her service record did speak to that, nor because she was the highest ranked, or genetically optimized, or even politically favorable. She was selected because she was known to make decisions under fire that considered survival not as an instinct, but as an equation, because she once negotiated a ceasefire while her own oxygen line was leaking, because she could listen to someone plan her betrayal and still find a way to salvage the relationship if it meant preserving the greater objective. The Council did not trust her. Not really, because they did not trust humans, but they had exhausted every other option. The Valen crew never transmitted back. The Zathari team sent a single scream that burst into static, and the Hegeron search units simply never returned at all. Their final coordinates marking where logic had failed and terror had taken root. And so it was agreed that Earth would send one, just one, and Earth agreed without protest, even as it quietly reactivated Protocol Echo 13 and encoded the ship's shape into every military training sim overnight. The shuttle carrying Reese was unarmed, unescorted, and laced with hidden failsafes. Not even she had full clearance to know, but she knew that the black ship changed on the inside, knew that it reacted to the thoughts or fears of the ones inside, knew that every species before had tried to conquer it, contain it, or explain it, and that each of them had failed in ways that left no corpses, only records of growing confusion, followed by silence the moment she stepped inside. The corridor behind her dissolved without a sound, not violently, not even mysteriously, just with the calm certainty of a door never meant to be reopened, and she kept walking without hesitation, her suit's sensors marking a geometry that shifted in ways that broke traditional math, but aligned perfectly with certain theoretical structures in Terran physics, structures she had studied, but never expected to see functioning around her in real-time. Walls blinked without lights. Space expanded where her eyes were not, and echoes began before her steps reached the floor, and she heard voices, distorted, looped, whispered in languages she half recognized from her interspecies diplomacy day shreds of the Zathari linguist's field journal, fragments of the Valen's ritual memory chants. A Hegeron war hymn, each one bent around her name, as though the ship was reaching backward through its own logs and trying to understand why she had come. She did not speak back, not yet, because she had learned long ago that silence could be more strategic than defiance, and because every step was being recorded through her neural thread and relayed to Earth's command center in bursts of encrypted pulses, though she knew they would not receive them in real time, and knew that even if they did, none of what she was experiencing could be explained without being first endured in her internal log. She described the place not as hostile, but attentive, not as alive, but intelligent in a way that made the concept of time feel decorative. And when she passed through a corridor lined with objects that appeared to be preserved artifacts of extinct species armor, instruments, even a ceremonial spear carved with molecular etchings, she began to realize that the ship was not a prison or a battlefield or even a tomb. It was a test, or perhaps something far colder. Her body was monitored by implants calibrated to detect panic responses, but she registered only elevated curiosity, though her heart rate had risen and her breathing was shallower, because she understood that she was not navigating a ship in the traditional sense, but a mechanism designed to examine the navigator, and that she had not entered it to explore, but to be explored. And when the floor shifted gently beneath her, and the corridor widened into a dome of impossible architecture, One where gravity felt like an opinion and light came from the edges of her memory, rather than any visible source. She stood still, centered herself, and said for the first time aloud, not in desperation, but in a tone calibrated for diplomacy, across unknown hierarchies, "If this is meant to be a conversation, I am ready to speak." When Reese emerged from the black ship's airlock, exactly 72 hours after she had entered, with no apparent injury, no visible strain, and a neural pattern that defied all existing brainwave classification, the silence across the galactic council was not broken with applause or relief, but with calculation, because no one expected her to return at all, and certainly not with composure. She walked with the same posture she had before measured, purposeful, military, but there was a precision to her gaze that hadn't been there when she went in, as if her mind now moved along different vectors, like it had negotiated with something vast and alien, and not only survived, but been changed in the process. And when she began her debriefing before Earth's High Command and the Council's remote observers, her voice was calm, and her words were not guesses. They were translations. She explained that the ship was not a threat in the way the Council had assumed, but rather a sentinel mechanism of precursor origin, a non-sentient construct designed to observe and archive responses of advanced civilizations when placed under conditions of irreversible unknown, and that it had not killed the other crews out of malice, but because their cognitive structures failed the trial. The ship was a container, a judge, and perhaps a warning, one that had been monitoring the galaxy for far longer than any of them. Had noticed her body scans were clean, but her mind was not the same. She had accessed parts of the ship the others never reached. She had seen simulations of entire cultures collapsed into emotional singularities, and she had been shown her own memories refracted through alien models of morality, not as punishment, but as calibration, because the ship had needed to determine what kind of being she was before it could determine whether to let her leave. The Council reacted with thinly veiled skepticism, accusing Earth of fabricating the outcome, of manipulating the trial, of potentially seeding the black ship with human-compatible technology beforehand. But Earth's response was silence, a strategic void that allowed the accusation to echo against itself. And while the political theater unfolded, Earth accelerated a quiet shift in its own posture across the galaxy, redeploying fleets under scientific banners, embedding diplomats into secondary trade routes, and placing small but permanent human contingents inside mixed research missions. Behind closed doors, Earth's leadership reviewed the transmission. Reese had sent from inside the ship part audio, part data string, and part something no human AI could fully interpret, which simply repeated a phrase in a voice that was hers, but processed through something deeper. This species pauses before it strikes, asks before it judges, and adapts before it fears. The Zathari, whose scout fleet had lost an entire division during their own exploration of the black ship, took the message as a challenge to their superiority and began advancing toward Earth's outer colonies under the pretense of technological containment. But when their vessels crossed into the solar system's outer threshold, their sensor feeds scrambled, navigation systems looped false coordinates, and comms degraded to bursts of static, not because Earth fired a shot, but because a classified network of quantum interference satellites activated a blindfold field around the inner system without broadcasting a single warning. The Council demanded a response, and Earth delivered one through Ambassador Marcus Vane, who stood before them with a posture that matched Reese's precise, unshaken, and he said with no elevation in his tone, "We understand now that the ship was not interested in power, but in restraint, and while we will not seek control of it, we will not permit its corruption either, because we know what it is watching for." Then he turned off the feed, not rudely, but with finality, and that silence began to spread, slowly, across the halls of every species that had once looked at humanity as bold, emotional, and volatile. and were now beginning to understand they had misjudged not Earth's strength, but its discipline, and that perhaps the black ship had seen something they had missed entirely. The first human retaliation was not loud, not public, and not meant to inspire fear, but when it happened, the Zathari Empire's central node lost control of its forward monitoring stations. All 5 of them, in under 20 minutes, their fleet. Coordination collapsed without a single vessel destroyed. Their fallback systems jammed by recursive logic loops seeded 3 years earlier, during a trade accord that had seemed too generous at the time, and while the Zathari War Council scrambled. To reassert command, Earth's only official statement was an archived quote from their own military doctrine. We do not strike first, but we always finish cleanly. What unsettled the Council more than the efficiency of the strike was its containment. Earth could have dismantled more, pushed deeper, crippled Zathari infrastructure entirely. But it didn't. Instead, it halted. The operation precisely at the border, recognized in pre-war treaties, leaving behind not devastation, but an unmistakable message. Humanity knew how far it could go, and it had chosen to stop inside the council chambers. Ambassador Vane stood once again under diplomatic scrutiny, and when asked why Earth hadn't declared war formally, he answered without arrogance or apology, because our objective is not conquest, and because the entity inside the black ship is still observing, still assessing patterns across civilizations, and we will not demonstrate ungoverned aggression when every action echoes in the architecture of something we do not yet fully understand. Though the Zathari pushed forward with sporadic engagements, their tactics were built on overwhelming force and predictive response models, and what they met instead were human fleets operating on adaptive protocols, formations that dissolved before impact, ships that rerouted gravity wells to shift their mass signatures mid-maneuver, drones with self-terminating AI cores that counterhacked Zathari systems and triggered false flag threats inside their own border zones. And everywhere they looked for patterns, they found Improvisation Rear Admiral Ellen Lorne, commander of the 8th Terran Response Division, became a figure of studied fear among Zathari tacticians, not because of her brutality, but because of how often she let enemy ships survive intact, disabled but untouched, escorted away under truce signals with no demands made. Her rationale always the same. This isn't about winning by subtraction. It's about proving we don't need to reduce our opponents to ash in order to be acknowledged. In the neutral systems, alien species who had once looked at Earth with wary fascination now began adapting Terran models, embedding human advisors in exploratory missions, revising their own military doctrines to include flexibility over supremacy, and even importing Terran psychological training to strengthen their diplomats against whatever tests the black ship might one day present them. Meanwhile, the Valen quietly switched allegiances, citing Earth's ability to project measured force as evidence of civilizational maturity, while the Hegron, still silent, began moving fleets into positions they had previously used only in defensive postures. A quiet acknowledgement that the war was no longer about border disputes, but about visibility, about being seen by something beyond the Council, beyond the stars, by whatever ancient algorithm still pulsed through the corridors of the Judgment. Core inside that ship, Reese walked again, not as an intruder, but as a presence now recognized by the architecture itself. And where before the rooms had shifted in geometric misalignment, they now opened smoothly as she approached, revealing structures and symbols from civilizations that had vanished before written history, each one frozen in the moment where their ambition outpaced their self-awareness, each one a mirror of what the galaxy could still become if it forgot. To choose restraint over reach or neural feed broadcast images, no one could fully interpret cities inverted into themselves, timelines compressed into glowing fractals, a spiral of glyphs that seemed to change shape depending on who viewed them. But she translated only one message in her official report. The construct is not waiting for domination. It is waiting for demonstration. And across every species that had once feared Earth's unpredictability, a new fear began to grow, not of destruction, but of being outpaced not by weapons or numbers, but by a species that had mastered the art of holding, back when it had every reason to strike forward. Reese entered the Judgment Core, not by force or puzzle solving, but because the ship had opened it to her without prompting, as if some invisible metric had shifted in her favor, as if her previous walk through its memory halls had been enough to grant a kind of clearance no key could provide. And as she stepped into the chamber, the laws of movement themselves seemed altered, not broken, but selectively applied, like gravity and time had become ceremonial rather than necessary. Space was not mechanical, nor ceremonial, nor even architectural in the way living minds built rooms. It was something else. A convergence field shaped by recursive logic and morality encoding, one that responded not to voice or thought, but to patterns in her decision-making, as though the ship had been watching not just what she did, but what she didn't do, and measuring intent as a more accurate predictor of species survival and capability ever was. At the center of the core, Reese witnessed an array that resembled both a library and a tomb, where data pulses floated like preserved memories, thousands of them, each locked in a shimmering cube of impossible compression, representing civilizations archived in their moment of terminal contradiction, some destroyed by their own hands, some lost in paradox, some trapped forever inside simulations of their own ambition. And though none of them were labeled, Reese recognized signs in the architecture around them. Fragments of species now extinct, memorialized by failure, she asked aloud, not out of arrogance, but because silence here felt like avoidance. What makes one species worthy to lead when leadership itself can become a form of destruction? And the response came not in voice, but in form and image from her own past. A flash of her refusing a direct order during a relief mission in the Orpheus Belt, choosing to risk court-martial rather than leave an injured alien crew behind. And then another image, a hypothetical, a version of her choosing differently, resulting in short-term victory and long-term collapse. The ship, or whatever protocol, ran the core was not seeking obedience, but a map of moral alignment under stress, a record of how a mind balances survival with cost. And Reese began to understand that she was not being examined as an individual, but as a statistical product of her species' evolving ethics under pressure. Meanwhile, outside, the war had not stopped, but its shape had changed. The Terran fleets were no longer seeking tactical dominance. They were shaping the rules of engagement, launching countermeasures that neutralized enemy weapons rather than ships, jamming systems without causing casualties, deploying Nanit's horns that disassembled weapon cores without damaging crew life support systems. And these decisions, expensive in terms of resources and timing, began to resonate across the war's frontlinesemy commanders. First suspicious, began issuing stand-downs when facing human forces, uncertain whether the next action would lead to battle or to dialogue, and in some sectors, temporary ceasefires emerged simply from pattern recognition whenever humans arrived. The war bent into stalemate, not because Earth had the biggest weapons, but because they had made restraint a doctrine and proved that moral clarity could be more destabilizing than brute force. The Council's perception of humanity began to fracture some. Believed Earth was manipulating a narrative to gain influence. Others feared that Earth was actually telling the truth, that the Black Ship had not chosen humanity as its agent of power, but as its proof of concept, and that if Earth succeeded in surviving both the war and the trial, the precedent would be set for what kind of civilization should endure when all others failed the test back inside the core. Reese stood before what she could only describe as a cradle of dormant simulations, untouched scenarios the ship had not yet run, possible futures waiting for the right trigger. And as she reached out to one of them, it lit with recognition, not because she initiated a command, but because the ship had already modeled her doing it, and was simply waiting to confirm whether she would follow through. She didn't touch it. Not yet, because she had come to understand that true authority didn't come from action, but from the decision to wait, and that the moment she made a choice on behalf of everyone else watching, it would not just be hers anymore. It would become the benchmark against which all future choices would be measured by something old, enough to remember the consequences of premature certainty. The second black ship appeared without signal or warning, emerging from the folds of unmonitored subspace near the outer territories of Hegeron influence, its structure nearly identical to the first, but darker, more condensed, as if its presence carried not an invitation but a verdict. And while systems scrambled to confirm its authenticity, every council channel went into emergency session, because they knew immediately this was not a replication. It was a response across star systems. Theories sparked like fire across dry grass. Had humanity failed the test? And now the trial was being extended to others. Had the ship duplicated itself to spread observation? Or was this the real ship, and the first merely a preface? But amid the panic, Earth remained silent for exactly 6 hours before issuing a single broadcast in plain, unencrypted galactic standard. We request the same terms we were granted. One will go inside. Reese volunteered again, not as a soldier or envoy, but as a constant, and there was no debate by now. Even her critics understood that the ship had not just responded to her actions. It had patterned its interaction around them, and when she approached the second vessel in silence, no escort, no weapon, the ship opened for her without hesitation, as if it had always known she would return this time. She was gone for 5 days when the second ship opened again. Reese stepped out unchanged in appearance, but unmistakably altered in presence, her speech more measured, her language layered with syntactic structures not native to any living species. And though her vitals were stable, the neural readings showed recursive signal loops moving across her cognition, like echoes of something still inside her, or something she had brought out with Hirsch. She addressed the council not from Earth, but from the diplomatic bridge orbiting the Hegeron capital, and her words carried no threat, only clarity. Vessels are not weapons. They are continuations. They contain not verdicts, but patterns. And now that we have answered, they will continue to ask. This was not humanity's trial alone. It was the galaxy's first measured step into being understood by something that does not care who rules, only who listens. Earth declined leadership in any formal sense, proposing instead the formation of a coalition of restraint, an interspecies directive centered not around governance, but around protocols for engagement, observation, and moral containment. And though the vote was contested, the resolution passed by a narrow margin, with Earth designated not as commander, but as permanent moderator, their role not to dictate, but to enforce the one principle the black ships had made clear. Survival without purpose is not survival. It is delay years past, and the war slowly ended not through exhaustion, but recalibration, as more species began encountering smaller artifacts tied to the ships, ancient satellite arrays, long-dead translation beacons, fragments of unknown code that now suddenly made sense under human-designed interpretation layers. And these discoveries continued to reinforce one central truth that no one could disprove. Only humanity had been allowed to enter, survive, and return. Race remained aboard the first ship, which had docked permanently to Earth's orbital defense ring, now surrounded by research stations and diplomatic platforms. But she no longer appeared in public channels nor issued statements. Instead, she consulted when summoned, observed without interference, and walked the internal halls of the ship like one who now belonged not to one species, but to the question the ship still asked. The vessel never moved again, but it remained powered, and its core continued to pulse with cycles no one could decode. And while the council's curiosity faded into administration, the myth around the ship only grew, because now the galaxy understood that the question had never been, why all others failed, but why only one succeeded, and what it meant that the answer had been human all along.